Russian and Spanish colonialism in California. While most people in California are familiar with the history of the Spanish missions and the stories about Gaspar de Portola and Junipero Serra traveling up the coast, there is very little discussion about the other European power present in California. In fact, Russia had colonists in North America as early as the 1760s, just prior to the foundation of the first California mission. The history of Russian colonies are essential to that of the Spanish mission system. And in fact, the Russian presence may have been a leading cause for Spain to expand into Alta California. Russian colonists on the California coast had different motivations from the Spanish missionaries, and interactions between the two, as well as each group's relations with the local Native Americans, shows this difference. While the Spanish sought to expand their empire, find goods for the crown, and convert the local people, the Russians had more commercial interests for their settlements, and maintained a less obtrusive presence to the native population. To begin, I will examine Russia's arrival in North America. This started with early Russian explorers and hunters. As early as the mid-1700s, explorers called Przemyśleniks were hunting otter in North America. Russian settlers took up residence in the Aleutian Islands, which are the cluster of islands from the Alaskan coast, which approach the eastern tip of Siberia. In Alaska, the purpose of these Russian settlements was primarily to hunt otters on the Alaskan coast, which were highly sought after in China and Europe. Sitka Island became the capital of the Russian-American Company in the 1780s and was headed by Governor Alexander Baranov. At the turn of the 19th century, Baranov had high ambitions to expand the Russian Empire further into North America after rumors began to spread about resources on the northwest coast. Supposedly at a diplomatic ball held around the 1760s, the Russian Empress Catherine the Great announced the foundation of permanent Russian holdings in North America. As word spread about this, King Carlos III of Spain began to worry about an approaching Russian presence on the west coast. He wanted to ensure that Spain beat the Russians there in order to lay claim to Alta California. To carry this out, Spain sent Gaspar de Portola and Junipero Serra to travel north and establish the first missions in Alta California. The Spanish expansion into Alta California began when Portola and Serra founded Mission San Diego in 1769. They traveled north from there, ultimately leading to 21 missions, the last one being San Francisco Solano in 1823. When the Spanish founded a new mission, they typically looked for areas with large populations of Native Americans. This allowed them to convert more native people, or neophytes. Now moving on to the reasons for Russia to expand into North America and ultimately travel into California. As Russians continued to make their capital in Sitka, their standing with the native Tlinkits worsened. What began as trading turned to using the native people for labor. In 1802, the Tlinkits revolted, using guns they had traded from early groups out of the US and Canada. They drove the Russians out of Sitka, but only for 2 years. Russians took back the settlement, but it was costly in resources and morale. In addition to the struggles with the Tlinkits, Sitka had severe issues with resources. Years of hunting otters and seals had left very few of the animals whose pelts generated most of the wealth from the colony, and Sitka struggled to maintain essential resources like grain for food. When rumors spread about land to the south with rich resources and abundance of otters, Governor Alexander Baranov supported the idea to explore and settle in California to expand the Russian Empire. The Russian journey to California was led by Nikolai Rezanov. In 1806, Rezanov set sail for San Francisco, planning a diplomatic negotiation with the Spanish there. They landed at Castillo San Joaquin, what has since become Fort Point next to the Golden Gate Bridge. One of Rezanov's main goals was to negotiate trade with the Spanish to retrieve emergency supplies for the people at Sitka. While the Spanish initially refused, Franciscan monks who acted as the middle party made trading possible between the Spanish and Russian groups. While in San Francisco, Rezanov began to court Commander Arguello's daughter. In a famous Russian courtship story, Rezanov and the younger Concepcion Arguello became engaged. Some speculate that Rezanov's actions were political, trying to improve the relationship between Russia and Spain, but others believe the 40-year-old, already a widower, was genuine about his relationship with the younger girl. Rezanov intended to travel back to St. Petersburg to receive approval for the marriage, however he died while crossing Siberia. His young bride-to-be waited for years, but when Rezanov never returned, she knew that he had died, and spent the rest of her life as a nun. Moving forward with Russia's entrance into California, Ivan A. Kuskov was ready to take up the torch after Rezanov's death. Kuskov was the assistant to Alexander Baranov, and to continue the mission of Rezanov, he finally chose a site to begin construction on a large permanent settlement on the California coast. In March of 1812, they began to build Fort Ross. Fort Ross was established near Bodega Bay with the support of local Native Americans. The Kashia-Pomo were the prevalent Native American tribe in the area. Before they began building, the Russians attempted to offer trade and employment, and even signed a cession with the local tribe leader to legitimize their new property. Russians chose a location far enough north to avoid influence from Spain and their missionaries, but also tried not to impede on the current native tribes in the area. The fort was intended to become the main outpost for hunting and collecting furs, particularly from otters around the bay. The Russians brought Aleutian Native American hunters who helped to hunt the otters as they did in Alaska. The settlers also attempted to produce essential resources for the Russian settlements in Sitka, such as grain, but the area's climate and the coastal soil was not suited for it. They discovered it was better for livestock, however, and the fort began producing meats, leather, wool, butter, and other products from livestock. Fort Ross became the center for the Russian fur trade in California. However, there were rarely more than 100 Russians living at the fort at any time. It was usually occupied by a majority of Aleuts, Pomos, or Creole people who had come from Russian and Native American parents. Because of their proximity and the necessity for collaboration, Russians and Spaniards in California had a great deal of interaction during their colonial periods. In 2011, the California State Parks Foundation held an event looking at Russian history in California to commemorate the 200th anniversary of the foundation of Fort Ross. One speaker from the Department of Anthropology at UC Berkeley, named Dr. Kent G. Lightfoot, spoke about the collaboration between the two foreign powers in California, particularly with Russia being an important source for trade and supplies.
So what the Russian American company began to think about was trade with other peoples. And one of the key options was Spanish California. Whatever the Spanish wanted, they would build it. And they would either obtain it through the Sitka, or they might even build it in Fort Ross. The Russians really helped provide many of the mission furnishings. Even though there was quite a bit of hostility on one level between the Spanish and the Russians, on another level, in terms of trade, there was a lot of connections and a lot of interactions, very interesting relationships that took place.
In addition to their interactions with each other, they both had different interactions with the Native Americans in the areas. Both had a serious impact on the native people. Sadly, each group brought new diseases that they had no exposure or immunity to. They also had different laws that they made native people adhere to, and would use native people in different ways for gaining resources or as labor. When the Spanish established their missions, they looked for places with a large population of natives in order to convert as many neophytes as possible. The Russians, however, looked for less obtrusive locations and sought the consent of the local people. The religious groups affiliated with the two colonial powers differed in how they enforced laws and interacted with the native people. The Spanish missionaries focused primarily on conversion. They allowed for marriages between the natives and the Spaniards, but they were very harsh against natives who disobeyed laws, compared to being more lenient towards Spaniards who acted out. Primarily from the Orthodox Catholic Church, Russians were less interested in conversion, but remained prominent in daily life. They also allowed for marriages between Russian settlers and the Aleuts or Pomos, but when people from either side broke laws or committed crimes against each other, they received similar strict punishments. From the reports by one famous Russian Orthodox priest named Father John Veniaminov, collaboration and diversity was important to Russian settlements. Although he gave sermons in Slavonic, he spent years learning Aleutian and working with translators on the Pomo dialect. In 1836, Father John toured the missions at San Rafael, San Francisco, San Jose, and Santa Clara to meet many of the Franciscans and Spaniards in the area. These two groups had important, lasting impacts on the native people and forged the history of California as we know it. People tend to know more about the Spanish history, the mission system, and the impact of conversion and colonialism on the native people as Spain sought to expand its empire. However, the influence of Russia as another external power cannot be forgotten. Russia focused primarily on commercial success through the fur trade, but was still a powerful country seeking to spread its colonial empire. In addition to the Native Americans and the culture they had already established, these groups all had to interact and collaborate in different ways. Each group factored into the foundation of California's history, and the Spanish, the Native Americans, and the Russians all need recognition for their individual and combined importance.